Hello everybody, this is Christian Chocolus, and this is my video about Christian Marxism. So I'm a Christian Marxist, and a lot of people ask me what that means. To them, it sounds like pure nonsense. Most Christians, especially in the United States, where I live, tend to be right-wing and are openly hostile towards Marxism. They hate it almost as much as they don't understand it. Even the so-called progressive Christians are usually very liberal, supporting center-right policies of the Democratic Party and looking on the left with disdain. Even people on the left tend to react with skepticism. While many leftists admire some of Jesus' teachings and are far from the religion-hating stereotypes that fundies always warn their congregations about, most leftists take Marx's statement that religion is the opiate of the masses seriously. But let's look at this quote in context. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion, as the illusory happiness of the people, is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. Christian Marxism, and any form of religious Marxism, simply understands that the abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people does not mean the abolition of religion entirely. It understands that under capitalism as well as earlier modes of production, religion served a specific social function, but that function is not intrinsic to the religion itself. In other words, religion, and Christianity specifically, can serve as a liberatory force as opposed to a reactionary one. It can take on a proletarian class character and aid in the liberation of the working class. Since Christian Marxism must regard contemporary Christian churches, including the Catholic Church and most Protestant and Orthodox churches, as fundamentally bourgeois institutions within the superstructure of capitalist society, it is important to study Jesus and the Bible free from the constraints of their teachings. The first step is understanding Christian origins through historical materialism. Christianity is unique in this regard because the historical conditions in which it emerged were very similar to modern capitalism, with a few small differences. Karl Kautsky wrote in Foundations of Christianity, "Roman society had reached the threshold of modern capitalism at the time of the rise of Christianity. The methods we have described here are roughly the same as those by which modern capitalism was founded, which Marx denoted as those of primary accumulation. Expropriation of the peasantry, plundering the colonies, slave trading, trade wars, and government debts." Ancient Roman society bore a striking resemblance to the 19th century capitalism that Karl Marx lived under. Many historians and even Marxists tend to simplify Rome's mode of production into just slavery, but the truth is that it had a very complex set of social and economic relations that included private property and slaves alongside wage laborers, much like 19th century America. Its economic growth during its golden age, from roughly the turn of the era to the 3rd century CE, was driven by imperialism and colonialism, much like 19th century Europe. Imperialism saw people in colonized lands, including the Jews of Palestine, go from small-scale agricultural production on family farms to becoming tenant farmers, working to provide a surplus to private landowners who lived in urban areas. This last fact is extremely important when considering the life of the historical Jesus of Nazareth, who Christians call Jesus Christ. While the Christian religious narrative is of a birth in Bethlehem in the year 0, historically, it is most likely that Jesus was born in the year 4 BCE in Nazareth, which is a tiny hamlet in the hills of Galilee. Nazareth was a Jewish town within walking distance of the great Gentile city of Sepphoris, and that very year Sepphoris was razed by the Romans after a failed rebellion, the year 4 BCE. These failed rebellions were a staple of Palestine, and especially Galilee, before and after the lifetime of Jesus. Simon Dubnov, one of the most important historians of the Jewish people, once wrote, "From Galilee stemmed all the revolutionary movements which so disturbed the Romans." A materialist understanding of economic and social conditions in Palestine explains this. Galilee is a hilly, rocky region, and such regions are generally prone to rebellion. Kautsky wrote of the Jews, The Jews in Palestine were the possessors of a mountainous country, which at a certain time no longer sufficed for assuring its inhabitants as tolerable an existence as that among their neighbors. Such a people is driven to choose between brigandage and immigration. The Scots, for example, alternately engaged in each of these pursuits. To add to that, Jesus grew up in a country ruled by Herod the Great and then his son Herod Antipas. Both Herods were close friends of the Romans and undertook massive construction projects to flatter their Roman overlords and spur economic growth. One of these would have been the rebuilding of Sepphoris, which took about 20 years, so would have taken place as Jesus grew up. Massive building projects like that would have required wage laborers such as builders, called tektons in Greek. And the Bible specifically says that Jesus was a tekton. Many Christians translate tekton as carpenter, but it more accurately means builder. It was the lowest rung of free society, especially among the Jews, whose religious mythology puts a high stock in farming ancestral land. Tektons were usually dispossessed families who had lost their land through foreclosure and had to survive by selling their labor. Were Jesus a Roman citizen, he would have been considered by the census to be a proletarian. It's this historical background that has to be considered when studying the life of the historical Jesus. By combining this approach with historical critical scholarship, a picture emerges of a Jesus in the tradition of Hebrew Bible prophets such as Amos, Isaiah, Micah, and Jeremiah, who excoriated the wealthy and powerful and advocated on behalf of the poor. Jesus joined a millenarian movement. That means a movement that is looking forward to the coming end of the world as we know it, led by John the Baptist. Then began his own after John's execution, modifying it heavily. Most importantly, he preached about a coming kingdom of God, which was a world without injustice, without hierarchy, without imperialism, without the patriarchal family structure, without money. His kingdom of God was literally to a T the stateless, moneyless, and classless society that we call communism. Jesus also created a praxis, which means theory put into practice, of traveling the countryside and sharing freely with the poor and marginalized. He and his disciples provided free healing to negate the central authority of the temple in Jerusalem, which was complicit with Roman imperialism. They treated women on an equal footing with men and even taught that Gentiles had a place in the kingdom of God. It was an egalitarian, anti-imperialistic, universalist, communistic movement. And it was also profoundly radical. Jesus did not just teach a benign message about helping the poor. He taught that in the coming kingdom, not only would the last be first, but the first would be last. That is nothing less than a religious expression of the dictatorship of the proletariat. After a prophetic demonstration against the temple, the seat of Jewish authority in Jerusalem, Jesus was summarily executed as any brigand would be, and in the most shameful way possible for a devout Jew: crucifixion. The cross was a profound symbol of state terror and Roman imperialism, reserved exclusively for political insurgents and runaway slaves. It was meant as a deterrent to show that the oppressive powers of the world, in this case Rome, were final. The heart of Christianity has nothing to do with creeds, with a set of beliefs, or with a book. It is the act of taking that cross, that ultimate symbol of oppression and domination, and turning it into a symbol of liberation. After his crucifixion, Jesus' followers actually went to Jerusalem and began a commune. They prefiguratively lived the coming kingdom of God, holding all goods in common and even taking care of all of the poor among them. That Christians eventually lost this revolutionary spirit does not negate the fact that Christianity began as a revolutionary movement and can become so again.
Jesus Christ was a man that traveled through the land, hard-working man and brave. He said to the rich, give your goods to the poor, so they laid Jesus Christ in his grave. Yes, Jesus was a man, a carpenter by hand, his followers true and brave. One dirty coward called Judas Iscariot has laid poor Jesus in his grave. He went to the preacher, he went to the sheriff, told them all the same, sell all of your jewelry and give it to the poor. So they laid Jesus Christ in his grave. When Jesus come to town, the working folks around believed what he did say. The bankers and the preachers